The only light in the barn that night was the lantern my father had left hanging on the post by the first stall. I remember the smell before anything else. Hay and cold air and the particular darkness that only exists inside a barn in late November, when the animals have gone quiet and the whole world outside has frozen into something hard and still. I was 14 years old. I was sitting on a milking stool with my knees pressed together and my hands folded in my lap, the way my mother had taught me to sit when I needed to hold something inside myself without letting it show. And I was waiting, not for the cows, not for morning. I was waiting to understand what I had done wrong. My mother had sent me there, not with anger. That was the part I could not make sense of for years afterward. She had sent me to the barn with the same quiet, careful face she used when she set a cracked egg aside on the counter. Not cruel, just decided. Before I tell you the rest of this, my name is Anna. I grew up Old Order Amish in Wayne County, Ohio, and I left when I was 43 years old. This channel is where I finally say the things that were never allowed to be said out loud. If you want to hear the truth that the community buried under silence and scripture, subscribe now and tap the like button. And tell me in the comments, had you ever heard that something like this was possible before today? I read every single one. Now let me explain what sent me to that barn. Because to understand it, you have to understand something about the old order world that most people outside it never learn. In my community, in the conservative old order affiliation I was raised in, the female body was not spoken about, not at the dinner table, not between mothers and daughters, not in any room where more than one person was present. The body was a private matter, which in practice meant it was a silent matter, which in practice meant that every girl came to the most significant physical moments of her life, having been told nothing and expected to manage everything. There was a word we used, though never directly. We said a girl had become a woman. We said her time had come. We said she was regular now, or we said nothing at all and simply handed her a folded cloth and looked away. The mechanics were passed in the most minimal possible way, cloth to girl, girl to silence. No explanation of why, no explanation of what her body was doing or what it meant. Certainly no discussion of what happened when the expected thing did not arrive. And that, the not arriving, was where the real silence began. In the outside world, a late cycle is a medical matter. A doctor is called, questions are asked, tests are administered. In my community in the 1970s, in a farmhouse in Wayne County with no telephone and a church district that viewed doctors as a last resort after prayer had been exhausted, a late cycle meant something else entirely. It meant suspicion. It meant watching. It meant a mother's eyes moving over her daughter at breakfast in a way that had no warmth in it, only calculation. I had turned 14 that August. It was the first winter after my body had changed. I did not have the vocabulary for any of it. What I had was the cloth my mother had given me without speaking, and the understanding, absorbed rather than taught, that this was now a monthly responsibility I carried alone. November came, then December. Then a third month arrived, and the expected thing had not. I did not know this was unusual. I did not know enough to know anything was wrong or right. I was 14, and I had been given no map for any of this territory. What I knew was that one evening after supper, when my brothers had gone out to finish the feeding, and my younger sisters were washing dishes at the sink, my mother looked at me across the kitchen table and said quietly, without expression, Go sleep in the barn tonight. That was all. Go sleep in the barn tonight. I did not ask why. You did not ask why. Not in our house. Not in any house in our district. The Ordnung did not need to explain itself, and neither did a mother operating within it. I took my quilt from the chest at the foot of my bed. I took my coat. I walked across the yard in the dark with the frozen ground crunching under my boots. And I went into the barn, and I sat down on the milking stool, and I waited. The cows shifted. One of the horses put his head over the stall door and watched me for a while. The lantern threw long shadows up the walls. I was not afraid of the cold or the dark. I had grown up in that barn, but I was afraid of something I could not name, the particular fear of a child who has been set aside without explanation and does not yet understand that the setting aside is the explanation. I stayed there 3 nights. My mother brought me food, bread and cold chicken wrapped in a cloth, left just inside the door without speaking. My brother said nothing. My father said nothing. My younger sisters knew better than to ask. The community had a way of closing itself around a silence like skin closing over a wound. By the time I came back into the house on the 4th morning, it was as though nothing had happened. Nothing was ever said. It took me many years and a great deal of time in a therapist's office in Worcester after I had left to understand what my mother had believed she was doing. In the old order world I grew up in, particularly in the more conservative affiliations of Wayne County in that era, a girl whose monthly time did not come was assumed to have done something. That was the architecture of the belief. The body's irregularity was not understood as biology. It was understood as consequence. A girl who bled late had, in the community's framework, likely given someone reason to make her bleed late. The shame was assumed before any evidence existed. The barn was not punishment exactly. It was quarantine. It was the community's way of managing a suspicion it could not yet confirm and would not speak aloud. My mother did not know that adolescent cycles are frequently irregular in the first year. She had not been told. Her mother had not told her. The church said nothing. The Ordnung said nothing. What filled that silence, as it always did, was assumption. And the assumption that filled the silence around a girl's body was never charitable. I want to tell you about my friend Martha because this part matters. Martha was from a neighboring district, slightly more conservative than mine, and she had been married young, at 18, and come to know me in the years after through the quilting circles that crossed district lines. We became close in the way that Amish women sometimes do, slowly, sideways, in the margins of tasks. 10 years after my nights in the barn, sitting across from her at a frame with our needles moving, she told me that the same thing had happened to her at 16, 3 weeks late. Her mother had not sent her to the barn. Her mother had done something I found, when she described it, even harder to understand. Her mother had gone to the bishop, not to ask for help, not to seek counsel for her daughter, to report the possibility, to place the suspicion into the hands of the church before it could grow into something the family could not control. Martha had been brought before 2 of the older women of the district, who had examined her and then declared that the irregularity was likely innocent and would not be spoken of further. Martha had sat in a chair in her mother's kitchen, while 2 women she barely knew looked at her body for evidence of something she had not done. She was 16. She had not been told what they were looking for. She had not been asked if she consented to being examined. She had been placed in that chair the way you place a jar on a counter, to be inspected for cracks. When Martha told me this, we were in our late 20s. We had both had children by then. We had both been wives long enough to understand, in the wordless way that Amish women understand things, what those older women had been looking for. We sat with our needles still for a long time. The silence between us was different from the silences we had grown up inside. This one had texture, weight. It knew what it contained, what happened over the next 11 Sundays after Martha's examination, the counting, the watching, the way a girl is seen differently once a suspicion has been placed into the air. Even when nothing is confirmed, I cannot carry all of it in this recording. There are things this format cannot hold. The names, the drawer, the dress she kept for 27 years. 3 years ago, I wrote it all down. The book is called The Sundays. The link is in the description and pinned in the first comment. I came back into my mother's house on the 4th morning, and nothing was said. But something had changed. I could feel it in the way my mother looked at me, or rather in the way she did not look at me. In the old order world, to be watched carefully is to be loved, in the particular way that community love expresses itself, through oversight, through attentiveness, through the knowledge that someone is tracking your movements and your choices and standing ready to intervene. To be not looked at is something else. It means the matter has been noted and set aside. It means you are no longer under watch because the watch has already rendered its verdict, provisional and unspoken, and is now simply waiting to see whether it needs to become permanent. I went about my work, cooking, sewing, helping in the barn in the ordinary way, the daylight way, the way that had nothing to do with sleeping there. I tended my younger sisters. I attended Sunday services. I sat in the women's section and kept my eyes forward and sang from the Ausbund, in the slow, ancient way we had always sung, the same notes my great-grandmother had sung, notes that had crossed an ocean and survived. 2 months later, my cycle returned and continued regularly for the rest of my life until it did not. No one said anything when it returned. There was no acknowledgement that the suspicion had been, if not spoken, at least dissolved. The silence that had held the accusation simply shifted and held something else. That is the particular genius of a silence that has never been named. It cannot be lifted. There is no moment at which it can be declared over. It simply continues in a different configuration, and you continue alongside it. I married at 21. My husband was a good man, a cabinet maker from a farm 3 miles east, with patient hands and a way of listening that was rare in men raised the way we were raised. On our wedding night, lying in the darkness of the room his father had built, I thought about the barn, not in grief, not in anger, in something more like wonder at the distance between that milking stool and this bed, at how much a life could contain without any of it ever being spoken. I did not tell him about the barn for 11 years. When I finally told him, we were sitting at the kitchen table after the children were in bed, the lamp between us the way lamps always are in the stories that matter. He listened without interrupting, which was how he listened to everything. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Your mother was afraid." "I know," I said. "That doesn't make it nothing." "I know that too," I said. We sat there a while longer. The clock, the horses, his breathing, all the things that do not change. I want to be careful here because this part is important. My mother was not a cruel woman. She was a woman who had been given no tools for what she was managing, and who reached for the only tool the community had ever placed in her hands, which was removal. When something in your world is irregular, you separate it until you can determine whether it is a danger. This was not invented by my mother. This was the architecture she had inherited and reinforced, and would pass along in turn, as her mother had passed it to her, reaching back through generations of women who had been given silence where knowledge should have been, and had done the best they could inside it. But here is what I know now, sitting in a house in a suburb of Worcester, with a computer on my kitchen table, and the words of a therapist I have been seeing for 6 years, still settling into the parts of me that were shaped in that barn. The system that sent me there was not designed by accident. The silence around a girl's body serves something. It serves control. A girl who does not know her own body cannot advocate for it. A girl who understands her monthly cycle as something shameful and irregular and suspect cannot ask questions about it, cannot go to her mother when something worries her, cannot seek a midwife or a doctor without the action itself becoming evidence of something to hide. My therapist said something I have thought about every day since. She said the shame had to be installed before the knowledge, because if the knowledge came first, there would be nothing for the shame to attach to. I sat with that for a very long time. The Amish world gave me things I carry with reverence, a faith that bent but did not break, not entirely, a capacity for silence that sometimes serves me even now in a world that fills every space with noise, the knowledge of how to tend a thing, an animal, a garden, a child, a marriage with patience and without drama. The particular beauty of a community that shows up for every frolic, every harvest, every loss, and asks nothing in return except that you show up in kind. But there is no theology that requires a girl to sleep in a barn, because her body is learning itself. There is no scripture that consecrates suspicion as protection. There is no God I believe in now who made a girl's body, and then intended for the first lesson she received about it, to be that its irregularities were evidence of sin. I was 14 on that milking stool. I had done nothing. I knew nothing. I was a child sitting in the dark holding a quilt against the cold, trying to understand what I had done wrong, and the answer was that I had done nothing wrong, and I would not learn that for 30 years. If you grew up in a world where your body was a liability before it was ever yours, I see you. If you were watched for evidence of something you had not done, I see you. If the silence in your house was not peaceful, but loaded, if the looking away was not respect but verdict, you were not wrong. You were not suspect. You were a child who deserved a mother who had been given the words she needed to give them to you. The failure was not yours. It was the system's. And the system was very old and very practiced at making the girls it failed believe the failure was their own. Leave me a comment. Tell me what stayed with you. Tell me if you knew that this happened. Tell me your story if you are ready, and if you want to keep hearing the truths from behind the prayer cap. Subscribe to Hannah the Amish Girl. I have so many more that have never been said out loud. The Sundays, what this recording cannot hold. The link is in the description and pinned in the first comment. The morning is yours if you decide it is.